Good evening. I'm Maryam Alavi, Dean of the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. Welcome to our presentation on diversity, equity, and inclusion in honor of Black History Month. Here at Scheller College, the diversity of our community is one of our greatest strengths. Inclusion and collaboration constitute an integral part of the Institute's and Scheller's strategic goals, and we are dedicated to driving meaningful advancements and progress in this space. Tonight's esteemed guest is Nzinga Shah, or Zing as her friends call her. She's a true change agent and a leader and pioneer in the DE&I space in the sports industry. Zing is the president of TurnkeyZRG, an executive recruiting firm in sports and entertainment industries. Prior to that, Zing was the Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer at Edelman Marsh McLennan, the NBA, and Starbucks. She was the first person to hold the position of Chief DE&I Officer in the NBA. She not only held that role for the Atlanta Hawks, but then further pioneered the contours of the role inside sports, assisting the NBA and other leagues and teams with defining the Chief DE&I role. Nzinga currently holds two positions at TurnkeyZRG. She is president in charge of operations, client services, new business development and strategy, as well as global head of diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. It is my hope that you will walk away from the presentation with insights on how you can make a difference in your own personal and professional lives. Creating a culture of acceptance, equity, and inclusion starts with each and every one of us and benefits all of us. Just as a reminder, before we get started, I wanted to remind our audience members that questions can be posted through the Q&A feature of the tool, the software tool, and we will get to as many as possible given time constraints. Zing, thank you for joining us this evening, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Alavi, for such a wonderful introduction and for always inviting me back to the Scheller School. Every time I come to your institution, I have a great time because your students are so intellectually curious and we always have a wonderful conversation. And so I'm always proud to be with you. And I want to wish everyone a happy Black History Month. I know that this month is just beginning, but there will be a lot of great events and wonderful reasons to celebrate this community of people, past, present, and future. And so when I want to get started by sharing a personal story with you all. It's really a story about why I got interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the first place. When I was growing up, it really wasn't a job function and it wasn't anything that I knew was possible. But I was very intentional about paying close attention to things that were happening in my life and made it a point to make this a career path. And so I want to share a personal story, and then I'll share a business story with you all as well. And then after all of that, we'll open it up to the floor for questions and answers. And so let's begin. I was born on November 14th, 1979. And by the time I turned 5 years old, I began to understand how important birthdays are because of all of the preparation, the hoopla, the celebration, and the presents that were associated with this day. I remember asking my mother why my birthday was so important. And her answer back to me has stuck with me for more than 35 years. She said, Zing, there are only two important days in your life. The day that you were born and the day that you find out why. Well, the good news is that I was clear on the first answer, but I wondered how and when I would figure out the second. My mother grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and she was the fifth of 10 children. She was raised from very humble beginnings in a small home that was filled with lots of kids, and lots of love. Her youngest sibling, Dexter, was 15 years her junior and almost like her child in many ways. She took care of him when my grandmother was at work cleaning homes in the city. She read to him, she nurtured him, she helped him pay for his college education at Howard University as he entered adulthood. As a child, my mother made sure that I was very close to my Uncle Dexter, and we would visit him in Washington, D.C. every summer, where he lived. When I was 14 years old, I returned home from school one day and I saw my mother crying in our kitchen. I immediately ran over to her and asked her what was wrong. She told me to sit down, and then she shared some devastating news with me. She said that Uncle Dexter was diagnosed with cancer and that he would be moving back to South Carolina to live with Granny so that she could take care of him. Then she delivered the worst blow. Uncle Dexter's cancer was terminal, and he only had a few months to live. I wondered to myself, how could this be? Uncle Dexter was only 33 years old. 3 months later, Uncle Dexter passed away, and my life was forever changed. I felt a huge deficit from this loss, but I always promised myself to keep him and his memory close to my heart as I continued my life journey. 5 years later, when I was 19 years old, I was a student at Spelman College here in Atlanta, Georgia, and I vividly remember the day that my English professor entered the classroom and told us that she would be giving us a surprise test. Me and my classmates waited anxiously at our desks for the test to begin, unsure if we were prepared to provide the right answers, but more importantly, hoping that we wouldn't fail. My professor then handed out the test paper with the text facing down so that we could all begin the assignment at the same time. Once she handed them out, she asked everyone to flip over the pages so that we could begin. To everyone's surprise, there were no questions, just a black dot in the center of the page. My professor carefully examined the expressions on our faces and told us the following. She said, "I want you to write what you see there." We were totally confused, but we got started on the mysterious task. Toward the end of my class, my professor took all of the answer papers and started reading each one of them out loud for all of us to hear. All of them, without any exceptions, described the black dot, trying to explain its position in the middle of the sheet. After all of them had been read, me and my classmates were silent and confused. My professor began to explain. "I am not going to grade you on this. I just wanted to give you something to think about." No one wrote about the white part of the paper. Everyone focused on the black dot. And the same thing happens in our lives. We have a white paper to observe and enjoy, but we always focus on the dark spots. Our life is a gift given to us with love and care, and we always have reasons to celebrate. Nature renewing itself every day, our family and our friends around us, the house we live in, the food that is provided for us to eat, the job that provides our livelihood, the miracles that we see every day. However, we insist on focusing only on the dark spots, the health issues that bother us, the lack of money, the complicated relationship with a family member, the disappointment with a friend. The dark spots are very small compared to everything that we have in our lives, but they are the ones that pollute our minds. Take your eyes away from the dark spots in your life. Enjoy each one of your blessings, each moment that life gives you, she said. On May 20th, 2001, I graduated from Spelman, and I looked forward to celebrating this accomplishment with my family. At my graduation party, I told my older cousin that I wished Uncle Dexter was with us. I wish that he didn't die from cancer at such a young age. She looked at me and said, "Uncle Dexter didn't die from cancer. He died from complications of AIDS. He was gay." I was horrified, not because of his sexual identity, but because he kept this part of himself hidden for most of his life. My mother, grandmother, aunts, and uncles never discussed it. They kept it hidden too, probably because they didn't accept it. They were ashamed of his identity, his sexuality, his lived reality, and they made it known to him. So he decided to protect his secret instead of living his life out loud. Even in death, he was inflicted with the dismissal of the acknowledgement of who he was. He suffered from onlyness, which translated into loneliness. Each one of my family members, in their closed-minded approach to life, contributed to his pain. But the single raindrop never feels responsible for the flood. It hit me like a ton of bricks on graduation day. I finally learned why I was born. Uncle Dexter's death was not the black dot. Rather, his life was the white space. I felt compelled to become a voice for the voiceless, and I promised myself that in my Uncle Dexter's honor, I would challenge societal norms and demonstrate allyship to onlys and others. I would dedicate my life to being an inclusive leader and dig deep to show acceptance, even when I didn't understand. In many ways, Uncle Dexter influenced my career path of leading inclusion and diversity in organizations and provided me with an opportunity to lead the way and chart a new path for change. Make a difference in the moments that matter. So my charge to you is simple. Be grateful for all of your blessings and demonstrate gratitude in all of your actions, big and small. Give and receive love and utilize that power to help people understand that our differences should not keep us apart. Rather, they should bring us together. Make this world a better place tomorrow than it is today by positively impacting others. Don't be judgmental, for we all have imperfections. Be risk takers, and don't be afraid to travel the road not taken, because you are uniquely positioned to pave a path for many others that will come after you. Be kind and keep compassion at the core of all of your interactions with others. And most of all, be happy. Everyone wants happiness. No one wants pain. But you can't have a rainbow without a little rain. And so I thank you for listening to my personal story of how I got my journey started. Many years later, I found myself working at the National Football League in New York at the league office, and I was an HR executive. And part of my role and responsibility was to evaluate talent and to evaluate high performers in the organization to ensure that we were giving them equitable opportunities to advance their careers and to be part of our system. And I vividly remember one day sitting in an executive meeting, talking with senior leaders about a potential opportunity for us to pitch a huge beverage sponsor to be the sponsor for all 32 stadiums. It was a huge, huge deal at the time, $30 million on the line. And so as we thought about how we were going to win this deal, we had to think about who the top talent in our organization was. And so in my HR capacity, I remember sitting alongside my colleagues and we discussed all of the people that could potentially be a fit. And some of the same words kept coming. We kept saying words like Harvard or Yale. We also talked about Bain. We talked about McKinsey. And those were recurring themes that were coming up when we talked about our top talent. And I remember asking the executives at one point to consider her. What about her? She has great experience. Perhaps she's never been put in a position to lead a charge like this, but we should really think about her for cross-functional opportunity. And I was met with a little bit of resistance. Well, Zing, we're going to give people an opportunity at some point, but we want to make sure that we fully have them baked. And so this is not the right time. And so after a long and exhaustive conversation, we ended up with 10 candidates to go on this very important pitch. All 10 of the candidates were men, all 10 of the candidates were white, and all 10 of the candidates were heterosexual. Because the words that we were using to describe what would make a person appropriate for such a pitch yielded this type of talent. And so we ended up sending these gentlemen on their way to create a work product that they could pitch to the client. 6 weeks later, they went to Purchase New York and met with the executive committee of the sponsor that we were trying to get. And immediately after their presentation, they were given an answer. And the answer was, unfortunately, we cannot do business with you at this time. And the reason that we can't do business with you is because we are managing a global organization and we have clients and customers all around the world. And part of that means that we have a responsibility to have cultural competency and understand the issues that are taking place in each of these areas so that we can resonate with them and ensure that we're meeting their needs. And we're not convinced that you all have the ability to do that in a partnership capacity at this time. And so we ended up losing the opportunity to have a $30 million 3-year partnership with a huge beverage sponsor. When I look back, I recognize that was because of the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so these gentlemen came back and delivered the news, and we ultimately decided that it was the right time to do things differently. So we started a diversity council, and I happened to be one of the people that was on that council. And the spirit of the council was good, the spirit in which it was intended to deliver. But we didn't have the organizational tools inside of the company at the time in order to ensure that we were reaching multiple audiences, because we didn't have an outside perspective. And so I used this as a case study for why I wanted to transition out of traditional human resources and start to focus very intentionally on diversity, equity, and inclusion. A couple of years later, I left and I transitioned to work for Edelman, which is the world's largest integrated marketing firm in the world, 67 countries, 5,000 employees. And so during my time at Edelman, I remember paying close attention to what our clients were asking us for. We had a variety of clients that hailed from all across the world, and they started to ask us for diversity, but not only for themselves. They wanted to see us in our company mirror and reflect that same journey. And so we went on a journey to begin our own diversity, equity, and inclusion function. And so there were a lot of learnings along the way. But what I learned most is that human beings, no matter what company you work for, what industry you work in, they generally want 2 things out of life. They want love, and they want to feel a sense of belonging. And so where organizations fall short is when we do not lean into these concepts and we make it good for some and not good for others. And so my career path has taken me to a lot of places since. I have been very intentional about ensuring that diversity, equity, and inclusion is embedded into the organizational fabric of every company that I've worked for since. When I say organizational fabric, what I mean is that this function cannot be managed for the purposes of client interaction and revenue generation. It has to be a lived experience for the people that work within as well. Most of the time, or at least in my experiences, companies are operating organizations from the perspective of a tale of 2 cities. A tale of 2 cities means that it's really, really good place for some people, generally people in the majority. And then it is a really tough place to navigate and oftentimes very painful for people that are in the minority. And so I have developed skills and tools and tactics and an overall strategy that I take with me to ensure that this gets embedded in every facet of the business, from the beginning of an employee's life cycle, when they're a candidate, how we are engaging job prospects, how we are ensuring that there is a fair and equitable process to ensure that we get to the right person for the job. And then once people are in the organization, it's important to ensure that we are not providing cookie cutter solutions for what they need. So in other words, the same PowerPoint presentation that is presented to all employees on one topic. But it's really important to understand individual needs and nuances that are going on within your organization so that you can tailor trainings and development programs so that we can reach each person where they're at. Everybody doesn't have the same starting point. And so it's really, really important to ensure that equity is what's being leveraged in organizations, not equality. So oftentimes people ask me, well, what's the difference between equality and equity? It's really unclear. And my answer is very simple. Equality means that you want to provide an organization or a framework for fairness. So giving the same set of tools and the same set of resources to everyone. Sounds like a good concept. But in many ways, equality, it won't work and it won't get us to the promised land because people don't start at the same place. And so for me, equity is a more, I would say, tangible tool for organizations to lean into, because equity is the concept of meeting people where they're at and giving the tools that are needed for each respective person so that they can reach their maximum potential. So I'll give an example of what this can look like. In the equality model, let's say we're at a baseball game and there are 3 children that are outside of the fence trying to look in because they're not inside of the stadium. One child might be very tall, and so they can see over the fence clearly without any need for assistance. Another child might be of medium height, and so they need a little bit of a boost in order to get their eyes over the fence so that they can see. And there might be a child who's of a smaller stature who can't see at all. In the equality model, you might give 3 boxes of equal height and width to each student so that they can use those apparatus to leverage themselves and to get up. But if the tall child can see over the fence, the box is really not necessary. If the medium child can see over the fence, it might be helpful. And if the smaller child can't see over the fence, the box, it probably won't help at all. And so in an equity model, using the same concept of the size of the children, you might say, okay, we have 3 resources. We're not going to give the taller child a resource at all. We might only give 1 resource to the medium child, and to the smaller child, we're going to give 2 boxes. So in both models, there are 3 boxes of equal size and equal width, but equity is providing a resource that a person needs so that there can be ultimate fairness in the end. And so I think about equity a lot. I know it's a word that's being used in the DEI space, and it's something that I think is really, really important. So organizations that are going to be going from good to great are going to be organizations that are using this equity model. And so as I navigate this new role that I'm in, I'm wearing 2 hats. I'm the president of a search firm, and we specialize in executive recruitment for all of the U.S. professional sports leagues and teams. So the NFL, the NBA, Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, and the list goes on. So I'm also serving as the managing director and diversity, equity, and inclusion practice lead for our parent company to ensure that our clients are getting the tools that they need and getting the strategy that they need in order to effectively manage DEI. And I'm also creating DEI resources for the company that I lead, because you can't have one without the other. You can't provide client resources and tools if you're not living it for yourselves, because what will happen is that clients will see through your strategy and think that it is performative, especially post George Floyd in 2020. We've got to get away from performative activities and really get involved with figuring out ways to holistically impact our organizations so that there is real change, and that the change is not something that comes and goes, but that is sustainable for the long term. So for each of you, you're pursuing degrees at the Scheller School of Business, one of the most highly rated top business schools in the country. You all will undoubtedly become part of organizations after you receive your degrees and your credentials, and you will have an opportunity to influence equity in your companies. You don't necessarily have to be a diversity, equity, or inclusion practitioner to make the change. You can do things like ensure that there's fairness in the processes that you're using and conducting, that you're going deep within the supply chain to ensure that you're giving equitable opportunities to people that touch your organization. And you ultimately need to ensure that everyone has access to reach their maximum potential. So at this point, I would like to turn the microphone over to Liz. I believe that she has been fielding questions from the audience. I encourage you to ask me any question that you would like. I will do my best to answer you with the best tools that I possibly can provide. but I'd love for this to be a dialogue and not a monologue. So please feel free to answer questions. And Liz, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Our first question is actually a comment. Zing, thank you for sharing such a personal and impactful testimony with transparency and courage.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate just that feedback. I think it's important to be honest about our lives and what happens in our lives. It's okay to reveal things that are not perfect. It's okay to also challenge ourselves and be honest about times when we could have done things differently or perhaps better. But in my opinion, the journey of life is really about evolving, evolution, pushing each other forward, supporting one another. And so I don't ever mind sharing my personal story because it is unique to me, but it's really something that has shaped my perspective and given me the courage to help others.
Thank you. We have another comment. Beautiful example. Thank you for that equity model.
You're welcome. I actually usually share a visual model that I created, and it's such a great way to show people the difference between equality and equity because it's a very hard concept to understand. But since I don't have the visual model up, I wanted to just describe it in words so that when you think about these concepts, you can close your eyes and really understand the difference because there is a difference.
And we have our first question. How can you ensure that unconscious bias is removed in the resume review, interview sessions, and hiring process?
It's such a great question. Unfortunately, you can never ensure that it is 100% removed because there are human beings that are conducting these processes, and we are all, unfortunately, situated in this world with some implicit bias experiences. However, there are tools that you can put in place to ensure that it is, I would of talent that you're evaluating that come from a variety of one institution to look for talent. I hear people say, I want someone from Harvard or worked at this company. And so we have to challenge ourselves to believe that people can show up exceptionally from a variety of experiences. I also think that there has to be a mechanism in place to ensure that the panels that are interviewing candidates are utilizing the same questions across the board for all of the candidates to answer so that when they evaluate the talent, there is a set standard for the competencies that were put in place, and you can measure them apples to apples versus asking one candidate something that's so far out of left field versus a question that you might have asked another candidate that might be really easy to answer. So there are definitely tools and mechanisms that you can put in. Unfortunately, because human beings are conducting these processes, it will never be 100% bias.
Thank you. How do you go about starting an effective DEI program? I understand it's ongoing, but how do you start something effective?
For me, the best way to start an effective program is to listen. The one Achilles heel that I've seen organizations do when they start this journey is to go straight into planning mode without listening and learning the people that are in the organization. They come up with solutions very quickly based on what they think best practices are, but they may not know pain points of their particular organization because they haven't been spending time with individuals, understand what the challenges are and what the I begin a role like this. I usually spend the first 90 listening tour. asking a lot of questions and not offering any advice whatsoever. And then when those 90 days are up, I take a look at all of my notes and try to extract themes, whether it's racial inequality, whether it's challenges for people that are LGBTQ, whether there are religious needs, and on. And once I figure out what the most pressing are, it is a lot more easy to develop a addressing the needs of the people that are spending 8 to 12 hours a day in the organization and that their needs are met. But you cannot start this work without a listening tour, in my opinion.
Thank you for sharing your story. Have there been times when you were penalized for your commitment to stand? And if so, can you share the experience and how it shaped or empowered your next steps?
Great question. I absolutely have been penalized for being a vocal advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think it's because people are uncomfortable with the topic. They oftentimes are uncomfortable with the topic because it illustrates and illuminates the things that they are doing wrong and how they have been a part of the problem. And oftentimes people feel like they are being judged and prosecuted when I expose issues in an organization that perhaps are not good and unsettling. And so I have certainly been in situations where I've received ridicule or been silenced, told that I'm not able to speak anymore about these issues, and minimized in my role. And so when those things happen, to the extent that I can stick it out and keep fighting, I do. But I think as a practitioner of this work, I have a moral responsibility and obligation to work in a company that truly understands that this is hard work, oftentimes painful work for everyone involved, and that we have to get to the ugly truths in order to get to the promised land one day. And so ultimately, if I realize over time that I am in an organization that is not supportive of this work, then I look for organizations that are supportive of the work and I pivot.
Can you provide an example of how companies can treat hiring candidates with the same level of equity model?
I mean, absolutely. I think, when you're, first of all, there's a war on talent right now. We're all very cognizant of that. We're in a time period that is being called the Great Resignation. Just last month, 4.5 million Americans quit their jobs. Some of them went on to get new jobs. Some of them don't have jobs to go to at all. But I think what is happening in the Great Resignation is that people are feeling empowered to demand their employers stand up for the things that they promised during the recruitment process. A lot of employers promise that their workplaces will be fair, they'll be equitable, there will be equal pay, there will be opportunities for advancement, there will be work-life balance. And when those things are not happening, employees feel like they don't have to stick around and that there are options and they can find other places to go. And so I think for candidates, when we think about who we're interviewing and how we can create equity for all of the candidates, we have to treat them fairly in terms of the salaries that we're offering. I don't like the question, what are you currently earning? It's not a good question for job or for employers to ask, because a person may not be currently earning an equitable salary. And so for me, it's more important for interviewers to say things like, this is what the job is offering, and make sure that you're saying the same number to all of the candidates across the board. There are many ways that we can be equitable when thinking about the candidate experience. Even some of the opportunities that we express to them that they will be eligible for in terms of job advancement, the time frames that we let them know that they'd be open and eligible for promotion opportunities. We have to ensure that we're saying the same things to all of the people that are being considered. That's how you create equity in the candidate experience.
Thanks so much for taking the time to share your wonderful perspective. In your opinion, are there any areas of opportunities in the DEI space that you would recommend prioritizing in 2022?
That's a great question. Listen, there is lots to uncover with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but for me, I think that there are some priority areas based on what we've seen in the workforce and what we are watching unfold in front of us. For me, there are three things that we should be focused on in DEI. I think accountability. So when things are not being fair and equitable, what are the repercussions for employees and executives and board members that are not being fair and equitable? If there aren't any repercussions, then there's no reason for people to change their behavior. So we've got to think about, what does an accountability model look like? We also have to think about accessibility. That's an area that has been, in my opinion, overlooked for a long time. You know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just about race and gender and sexual orientation, but I think accessibility is a huge topic. So, you know, people that have limb differences or people that have challenges with hearing or with their sight, what are we doing in terms of our organizational resources and practices to ensure that they can come to work and that we can provide resources and tools so that they can be real contributors? I have had the opportunity and privilege to work with many employees that were blind, that were deaf, that had limb differences, and they were exceptional workers. So we've got to go deep into accessibility. And then I think the third area is clearly identifying metrics for success. So, you know, we've got to have a method of measuring whether or not we're actually heading in the right direction or if we're continuing to stay stagnant. Those would be the three things that come top of mind for me.
Are there institutions or companies that do a good job and have the best practices to model in the DEI arena?
Absolutely. And you know what? I'll use one of our hometown organizations. I'll talk about the Coca-Cola Company because I think they are doing a wonderful job of managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I don't think that it happened overnight. As many of us recall, back in 2000, the Coca-Cola Company went through a large class action suit around race and gender equity. And it was really the largest class action suit in the history of the United States. They ended up settling with their disgruntled employees for $194 million in punitive damages, in addition to having to comply with the EEOC for a period of 5 to 10 years to ensure that they were putting policies and practices in place so that this wouldn't happen again. And sometimes I think organizations have to go through a crisis like the Coca-Cola Company had to go through in order to have their blind spots revealed and to put mechanisms in place to do better. And so 22 years later, I think they're doing a really good job. And if you look at a lot of their diversity campaigns or even their chief diversity officer, who happens to be my good friend, Lori Billingsley, George, there's just a lot that they had to go through to get there. And so I guess my counsel to all organizations, whether you're doing an okay job or an exceptional job or not doing anything at all, is to be proactive. Get started in this work because you know it's the right thing to do and because you want your company to be best in class. Don't wait for a crisis or the EEOC or any legal institution or governing body to tell you that you are in trouble and now you have to do this work. For me, it's much more important to be proactive than reactive.
What are the most compelling reasons to highlight to your HR department when trying to prioritize DE&I efforts?
Well, the question is good because there is a perception that human resources is how we manage DEI. I will actually take us in a different direction and say, I don't prioritize this with HR. I prioritize this with every facet of the business, starting with the CEO. So in a few of my roles, in my role at the Atlanta Hawks, in my role at Starbucks, and at my role now, I always report to the CEO around this work. And that is critically important because when the top of the house understands this and prioritizes it, then that person will ensure that it gets funneled down throughout the organization holistically. But if we only relegate diversity, equity, and inclusion to the human resources function, we're only thinking about 30% of what the job can do. We're alienating marketing, we're alienating finance, we're alienating supply chain, we're alienating all of the business operations that take place and run the organization holistically. So I don't necessarily start my work or only funnel it through HR. I actually start with the CEO and ensure that it is part of the holistic business strategy in order to get this work done.
What advice can you give to someone who works for an organization that has foundational work to do to operationalize DEI, where there is no DEI framework and there is no investment toward DEI?
It's a hard thing to do when you don't have a budget, when you don't have a person in charge. I mean, it's almost like chasing a ghost. And so I think what I would do in that situation, and I have been in that situation, is try to create the function. You know, I started diversity, equity, and inclusion in the MBA. I was the first chief diversity officer, and it was my idea. I was working at Edelman at the time, and I became a crisis counselor for the Atlanta Hawks. And the Atlanta Hawks went through a very public-facing racial crisis. And as a crisis counselor, I remember saying to Steve Koonin, their CEO, a really good thing for you to do would be to create a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer position, give that person a budget, make that person report to you, and then give them the tools that they need so that you can make this a sustainable job function and be proactive. And so if there's no money currently in your company or there's no diversity officer, socialize the idea with executives that are there. Give them a business case and a scenario for why this makes sense, how it can create bottom line impact, and how it can also positively impact the culture. People don't realize it, but culture eats strategy for dinner. Culture is way more important than strategy. How people feel, how they think about your company, that's the reason that they show up. That's the reason that they stay committed. And so you have to make a business case to the people in charge that this will positively impact the culture, which will ultimately impact our bottom line.
Given the latest NFL lawsuit alleging racial discrimination in head coach hiring practices, are there similar circumstances occurring in corporate recruitment in terms of compliance with diversity policies, e.g. the Rooney Rule, with no actual intention to consider diverse candidates for opportunities?
It's a hot topic. It is top of mind for me. And as a person who worked at the NFL for a couple of years, I actually have a strong perspective on this topic. And so what I would say is I think that back in 2003, when the Rooney Rule was established, it was established with good intention because there was a lack of coaches of color in the NFL and they wanted to put a stake in the ground and make a difference. 19 years later, here we are in 2022, there were 3 Black coaches and now there's only 1. So it's actually regressed. And I think that it's regressed because the Rooney Rule has got some flaws. First and foremost, the Rooney Rule is a policy in place that states you must interview a coach of color in the process for either a head coaching position or an executive position on the football operations side of the business. But there is no demand that any of those candidates would ever translate into a hire. And so it's become almost performative, like a check the box activity. And we have unfortunately not seen the fruit of what this rule was established to materialize. So I think that while it was put in place for a good reason, if you have people in your organization that have real implicit bias, decision makers and key strategists at the top of the house that don't truly believe in the value of something like the Rooney Rule, then there are ways that they'll get around it, and they'll see the candidates, but they don't necessarily have the intention of hiring them, and there's no mandate for them to hire them. So it's almost like playing a game. And we'll see how the court case evolves. I'm just like you guys. I don't know the facts. I only know what I'm reading in the media. But I would say holistically, there obviously is a regression because data doesn't lie. The numbers don't lie. And so if in 2003 we had 3 coaches and in 2022 we have 1 coach, in my opinion, this policy is not effective.
How can I tell that a new potential employer has a quality DE&I program in place? What are good questions to ask in an interview to probe for this kind of structure?
I love the question. I think there are things you can ask, but I think there are also things you can research before you get there. So, I mean, certainly questions you can ask are, what is this company's DEI strategy? What is the approach to the work? Do you all have employee resource groups? Are there tools in place for accessibility? Are there mechanisms to ensure that there's fairness and equity in pay? So you can ask questions like that, but I think you can also do your own research and figure out who's on their board. Do they have women on their board? Do they have people of color on their board? Are there people that are LGBTQ on their board? What are the religious differences on the board? Same thing with the executives in-house. These are things that are not too hard to find out if you do a little bit of digging. And so oftentimes companies can easily say things or put out a statement of purpose and mission around this work, but their actions are reflective of what they really truly value based on who's in charge. So that's how I would really approach figuring out if the words that they use around diversity, equity, and inclusion are mirroring their actions.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Thank you for sharing your lived and learned wisdom with us. What are some of the readings or trainings that you most recommend for a department beginning a DE&I task force or committee, or authors you feel are most effective in equipping advocates in departments where resistance might exist?
Great question. So there are some trainings that are out there right now, and they're not really expensive. I think I would say at minimal cost, and oftentimes some of them are free. They're offered by Stanford University, Yale University, Harvard has some things going on, and Cornell. I've taken all of their trainings and enjoyed them. And I think that they're good because they're all very different. They approach the work very differently. So I'm looking through different lenses as I've been going through these programs. There's also a lot of great literature that's being written right now. There's a great author. She's actually a Spelman alum like myself. Her name is Tara J. Frank. Her first name, most recently, that I find to be very compelling because she's not glossing over some of these topics. She's going deep into content, and that's what we need at this point in time. I would also say make sure that you're reading periodicals like I would say, Society for Human Resources Management. They've got some great content out there on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity Inc. publishes some wonderful literature as well. There are a lot of tools out there, so we've got to make sure that we're digging, get involved. Go on LinkedIn, a lot of podcasts that you can click onto, or even scholarly articles that are being posted on LinkedIn. There's some good content that people are sharing with one another. So those are the places that I would begin.
Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I am going to ask you if you will please repeat the name of the author. At least for me, the voice was not very clear. So please repeat the name of the author, please, that you just mentioned.
Yes, her name is Tara, T-A-R-A. Her middle name is J, J-A-Y-E, and her last name is Frank, F-R-A-N-K. Tara J. Frank. Just Google her. She has a lot of books out there, and she's exceptional.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, your voice wasn't clear when you were mentioning that. Thank you so much for this very powerful presentation and discussion. We have all come away with a deeper understanding and appreciation of just how important it is for individuals, teams, and companies to actively engage in bringing about major change in this area. I challenge those in attendance to act on just one thing you have learned this evening. It is through our individual choices and actions that we will be able to build equity and inclusion and change the future of business and society. Thank you to all of our audience members for taking the time to attend this discussion. And thank you again for your wonderful presentation, Zing. And I cannot wait to invite you back and hear you again. This concludes our program, and have a good evening.